Welcome to Why I Hate Your Podcast. These days, there are a lot of podcasts to choose from. This is another one. I'm Crystal, and each week my brother Sean and I meet up to talk about two podcasts and why we hate them, or don't. Join us and we might help you find your new favorite podcast, or save you from wasting time on a podcast you might hate. This week, the first podcast we're going to be discussing is 372 Pages, We'll Never Get Back, which is a podcast that was created by Michael J. Nelson and Connor Listoka. Michael J. Nelson was one of the stars of a show called Mystery Science Theater 3000. I think he started in the 90s, although the show originally started with a different host in the 80s. And is also one of the founders of Rifftrax.com, which Connor Listoka is a fellow writer for Rifftrax. And for those of you not familiar with MST3K and Rifftrax, MST3K was a show, cable access show that started in the 80s, was picked up by Comedy Central. And the idea was it's a dude stuck on a spaceship that he was sent up there by mad scientists and is forced to watch terrible movies. And so he built a couple of robots who, along with him, watch the movies and make fun of them. So it kind of was the birth of the concept of riffing films, really bad films. And so Mike Nelson, after that show ended, started up the website rifftrax.com, where you can download the audio riff track and then, watch the movie if you own it or if you're streaming it or whatever, and play the riff audio track along with it. And we get the kind of same experience. And it's him and two of the original cast members from Mystery Science Theater 3000, Bill Corbett and Kevin Murphy. Now, Connor Listoka also writes for them. And so Mike Nelson and Connor Listoka founded this podcast where they sort of apply the same concept to books. It's a podcast where it kind of works like a book club, right? They come up with a book that they're going to read, generally one that they're pretty sure they're not going to like, i.e. a badly written book. And they go through, and each week they'll, publish an episode where they're reviewing it, they're making fun of it. They have a couple of recurring segments, Dumb Sentence of the Week and Fanfic or Real, which we'll talk about in a little more in depth as we get into the review. And, they started out with Ready Player One. Now, I've been listening to this podcast since its inception. So I've listened to not all of the episodes, but I've listened to most of the episodes. But I think you just started with this one. You listened to what? I think like 5 episodes?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. And why don't you go ahead and tell me what you thought since you're the newcomer to this series?
I do like the idea. I mean, it comes from the same vein of Mystery Science Theater and Rifftrax, which Mystery Science Theater I am very familiar with. They're the entire catalog of the series, whereas Rifftrax, I mean, I've seen a couple, but I know it's kind of within the same vein. And you could definitely feel the same sort of humor that you would see in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 episode or a Rifftrax episode in their book review. And what I like about it, it's more of a book club type setting to where you meet once a week after reading 3 or 4 chapters and cover the what happened in the book. But for them, they come at it from a basis of, okay, we need to tear the book down and make fun of it, as opposed to, discussing any merits that may exist. And with that being said, the books they choose are books that are typically considered to be not the best books. And and since I'm new to the podcast, or new to that podcast series, I looked through the library, and apparently I must have good taste in book, because out of all those books, there was only one I read, Ready Player One, so I decided to listen to that one, which happened to be their very first series. And so it's definitely entertaining, and even after, even though I'm probably about halfway through the Ready Player One podcast series, I will finish it, because I'm interested to see where... how they end up with the story as it progresses.
Now, I have listened to I re-listened to a couple of episodes because I couldn't remember. I know that they sort of have changed a little bit over time. I know the fan fiction or real segment was added at some point during Ready Player One, but I can't remember at what point. Did you get into an episode with that?
Yeah, it was within episode 2 maybe, or even 3 that they introduced that.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite segments because, well, that's one of the things I really like about this podcast. I'm not one that, engages a whole lot on social media with the podcast that I listen to, but they have a lot of fan engagement with this one. So, like, their Patreon supporters are kind of a big part of the show now. So with Ready Player One, they started out with the fan fiction or real. They actually found that was a hugely popular book. So they found tons of fan fiction online that they could use. And, the concept is one of the hosts will go and cherry pick some really entertaining fan fiction as well as some sections of coming in the book just by kind of flipping through and finding stuff. And then the other host, generally it's Connor reading them and Mike has to try to guess. And it's sort of turned into a game now where Mike has a really terrible track record at this. But when they started getting into some of the really weird books in future, because there are some really weird books that they review as they keep going. One of my favorites being Trucking Through Time. But in those cases, of course, there's no fan fiction. So the fans of the podcast in the Patreon supporter group started writing their own fan fiction for that segment. So now, for most of them, every once in a while, I think right now they're doing like Midnight Sun, which is the new Twilight retelling. And so a lot of the fan fiction they've been able to pull actually from the web. Ironically, one of them was actually a fan fiction written by E.L. James, who's the author of 50 Shades of Grey, specifically about Twilight. So that was entertaining. But there's just a whole lot of fan engagement because they have that segment. And then they also have the segment, what is it called? Oh, it's just the email segment where they'll read like emails and commentary. Oh, and then Dumb Sentence of the Week. They'll also take in fan suggestions for that. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, and I think they kind of started with the accepting the fanfiction entries probably within the second episode that they introduced the fanfiction or real section, because they had mentioned that they had gotten some people who submitted some rather terrible sentences. And I'll be honest, like when they were doing it for Ready Player One, there was, even though I've read the book, I couldn't tell which one was fan fiction or which one was the real one.
Yes.
And I was disappointed that I usually chose the fan fiction one in my mind before they revealed which one was the real one.
They've really got some talented fans that have submitted some fan fiction. Because like I said, now it's become let's see if we can fool Mike every week. And so they really try hard. And sometimes they go a little over the top, and that'll be like the tip off that, okay, you guys are trolling me now. But yeah, it's really entertaining. And I think, it's actually that segment of the podcast is probably my favorite. Like I do like the recaps where they go through and to your point, I read Ready Player One, unironically, as did you, and really enjoyed it. And I didn't even realize how badly written it was until I listened to this podcast and they started really pointing it out. Because you read it really fast. It's an easy read, so you don't really stop to think about it critically. But boy, howdy, it's not a well-written book at all.
Yeah, and it looks like for most of their books, a lot of these books are written for the widest audience possible, and they kind of mention that as well in Ready Player One, that you kind of when you're writing for the widest possible audience, you have to write for the lowest common denominator, and I do feel that there are cases where you can see that in Ready Player One, even though you may be kind of blinded by the 80s nostalgia. It seems like a lot of the books that they review are kind of in that vein, and they kind of come at looking at it at more of a critical standpoint, like this is not what good writers do, and sometimes that may not be the point. I mean, one could argue that Twilight was written for young middle school girls, and
yes,
they're not going to have the literature acuity to read something like Bleak House by Dickens. So that's one of the things that it does provide fodder to them, but I think sometimes that there may need to be context, and maybe it's a fault of mine trying to take what they're saying too seriously as opposed to face value. Because I don't feel like they clearly define that, yes, we are legitimately critiquing or we're cracking a joke.
Right.
And so sometimes I'm like, oh, come on, that's a bad joke because for XYZ reasons, from a literature standpoint, but it was an easy joke for them to make. And I do see that. So a part of me is a little confused about what exactly they're trying to accomplish. I assume it's merely just for the comedic factor. But it almost seems like Mike is more on the comedy side as opposed to his co-host. And I feel that it's confusing to me, like what is their primary goal? Because sometimes they'll just come off like, oh, that was dumb, and they kind of will have almost kind of like a super pretentious Rex Reed take on it. But again, it could be just simply like they're just trying to do whatever's funny.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point, that I think they're relying very heavily on the fact that they when they launched this podcast, they launched it basically to their Rifftrax audience, right? Like that's how I knew about it, because I've bought tons of Rifftrax, and I follow them on social media, so I know when they have new stuff being released. So I knew about this podcast through that connection. I think that's really how almost probably 90% of the people that listen have found it. So they're probably relying on that a little too heavily. So if somebody comes in cold who isn't thinking of, oh, this is like Rifftrax or MST3K for books, then I think they'll have the same experience you're talking about, because they can get really nitpicky. And I do think occasionally they'll acknowledge, like for sure they've been doing it on Midnight Sun, where they'll acknowledge that, well, clearly we are not the audience for this book, like they said it several times. So I think I think they get a little better about that as they go forward. Plus they start getting into some really obscure stuff. There are a couple of books that I didn't follow along with them. I skipped those episodes because I fell behind at one point. But yeah, I think they tend to, it's almost like Rifftrax or MST3K, because honestly, the best episodes of MST3K and the best Rifftrax are always ones that are about really bad movies, right? Like they have Rifftrax for really good movies. Like you can download, Rifftrax for, I think, Jaws and, just classic movies. And they're fun, but they're nowhere near as entertaining as like Birdemic or, these terrible, terrible movies that are their specialty. So I think with the books, it's sort of the same. Like the episodes that really shine are when they're reviewing like really terrible books. And while Ready Player One isn't great in terms of how it's written, it's still an entertaining story. But you get into stuff like Trucking Through Time or Shadow Moon. I can't recommend the series on Shadow Moon because that book is brutally long and awful. I didn't even read it with them, but just listening to it was like, my God, this book is so bad. But that's the ones where they tend to really shine. I think in this podcast is a little better and more fun to listen to from a comedic perspective.
Right. And I think that's kind of like the whole Calibrate Your Taste segment kind of gives you an idea of where they're coming from. And it's obvious like Ready Player One was not a book written for them. I mean, they're beyond the age, because it's almost like they take everything literally. Like everyone talks about Ready Player One's about 80s nostalgia, in which that is a very fun part of the book, and it kind of distracts from just like how poorly written it is, or how accessible the writing is, I guess is probably a more PC term. It's obvious they think it's supposed to be only 80s references, right? But you have references from the late 70s all the way up through, the mid 90s or even the early 2000s, and it's kind of more like your millennial culture or your Gen X culture, things that they would enjoy. So, people who enjoy the Atari, the Nintendo, and Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, The Goonies, they enjoy things like Firefly when they're adults. So,
right.
And that's one of the things they brought up. They were like, why is Firefly in this? It's not 80s. And I'm like, well, I don't know if actually Ernest Cline ever said, oh, this is about 80s nostalgia only. That just seems to be what everyone talked about, because it's predominantly most of it. But, and I think as someone within that age range, because probably Mike and they're probably both, I don't know, a good 15, 20 years older than us. So they're kind of outside. They're boomers, right? And they're kind of outside of that area. And whereas I think something like 50 Shades of Grey would be much much more fitting of a Rifftrax setting, because that's not written for middle school kids. That's written for, young adults. And we're talking people who are, 18, 20, 24. It's probably 18 to, well, at least probably even women in their 40s really enjoy those books. But it's written for somebody who's like in the 12th grade.
Right.
Which is kind of inexcusable, whereas, and I guess you could make the same argument for Ready Player One, which is that it's written for people who lived through the 80s, who lived through the 90s, and they're adults now, and they want to have this nostalgia, but it's written for somebody who's like 12 or 13. So maybe I just kind of contradicted myself that maybe Ready Player One is a fitting book for them to critique.
Well, and I will actually point out that Mike is, I think he's like right at the tail end, like he's literally in the last year, the cutoff of Boomer to Gen X. So he's like super early Gen X, but Connor's actually 39 years old. So he's actually our age.
Oh, okay.
So he's really the sweet spot for this, at least the nostalgia piece of this. But I think it's clear that, his background still isn't quite, I don't think he was like a nerd in the 80s. I think this book was really written for like late Gen X, early millennials who had some portion of their childhood in the 80s and 90s, childhood / young adulthood. So basically like our age, born in the late 70s. It's clearly designed to hit that sweet spot, which I mean is pretty smart from just a marketing perspective if you want to sell your book, right? Like nostalgia for that era is really popular right now. But yeah, I think I think that it clearly didn't really work for either of them.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to the humor in Rifftrax and MST3K as a whole, that these people watch terrible movies, and a lot of these movies were made in the 50s and 60s and 70s and the 80s. So if you go back to the MST3K catalog, that those 30 years probably account for 90% of the movies that they would use on MST3K. And these guys are like steeped really in old movie lore, in terrible movie lore, and obscure movie lore, and this was an issue I've always had with MST3K, and it probably exists in Rifftrax. Like I said, I haven't seen too many episodes of Rifftrax, and I kind of feel it here also with this, is that a lot of the subjects of jokes are extremely obscure, right? And so, and with that, a lot of those jokes don't really necessarily land because nobody knows who you're talking about, right? If they're cracking some sort of joke. And that's just a tendency, I guess, the fact that they have such a repertoire of movie experience that they don't realize that maybe not everybody else has that, and a lot of their references that they use for their own jokes are pretty obscure.
Yeah, I do think that's a flaw, or not maybe a flaw, but it definitely can impact the listening experience, similar to MST3K. I do know that we watched so much MST3K growing up that as I've gotten older and I've started watching sort of older movies and more classics and things like that, I've picked up on some references that I'm like, oh, I remember that from an MST3K episode. Now I get the joke. But the nice thing I will say is that sometimes, because Connor's so much younger than Mike, sometimes he will ask the question. So Mike will make a reference in a joke like, oh, he's not exactly so-and-so or something, and laugh or chuckle. And Connor will be like, well, in case we don't have any listeners who know who that is, why don't you tell us who that is, And so there have been some instances of that, I think, where he's like, I don't know that reference either. So I think that helps a little bit. But you're right. Like, it's very clear that, and even between the two of them, Mike especially has that, that wide range of older films, and clearly his tastes, based on the Calibrate Your Taste segment, I think are definitely more towards stuff that isn't made just purely for entertainment value.
Right. And I feel that this podcast in general, if it wasn't wrapped in a cloak of comedy, it would come off as extremely pretentious, and which I don't mind. I think the comedy saves that, and I think Mike is especially good at if you like Norm Macdonald humor, he has a very similar kind of dry sarcasm humor, and I think it's kind of more of the character, like he dreads reading these books, where his co-host seems a little bit more excited to read these books, or at least more engaged. Michael's just like, why am I doing this? why am I doing this to myself? So he has this kind of blasé attitude towards it.
Yes.
And I think that's just part of the comedy of it. But his timing and his delivery is always very good. And like I said, if you like dry, sarcastic humor, even though some of the jokes may be obscure, he is legitimately funny, though.
Yes, and I think what's entertaining to me is when they get into books that are, because they actually take a lot of delight in sort of innocently badly written books, which they've done a couple of, and in Ready Player One, it's clear, like to your point, Mike has this, A, it's not for him, and B, while there's bad writing, it's just not, he's not enjoying it. Like, he's not getting any real entertainment value out of it. Whereas when they do something like, like Trucking Through Time, or I think even The Mister, they actually enjoyed because it was so ridiculously bad. They actually, they're enjoying themselves, right? Like, they can still enjoy the reading experience, even though it's awful. It's like delightfully awful. They really like that stuff, which is sort of like their taste in movies for Rifftrax. Like, where they really have fun is the stuff that, the film was made earnestly, even though it's horrific, like The Room or Birdemic, right? Like, you can tell all the actors.
I was about to bring up The Room.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and Mike mentions, I think, Tommy Wiseau multiple times because, even though that's such a bad movie, it's like it was earnestly made, and that just makes it hilarious, right? So
yeah,
I think they, the jokes about, because I keep mentioning it because it's my favorite book in the series, but Trucking Through Time, the author is like this, retired truck driver, and he's a big, like, his profile, he's a big fan of whatever local football team he has. I don't know. And he's an older guy, right, when he wrote this. And so the running joke through the series is, Grandpa, no, because there's these, really suggestive scenes or really in bad taste scenes. And so they really, you can tell on those types of books, they really shine because not only are they having fun with the book itself, but they're actually enjoying it because it's just that bad. And there's another one, and I can't remember the name of it, but it involves a character who's basically like a male version of a Mary Sue. And he's like a school teacher who gets asked to go to space, right? And it's one of those books that was like self-published on Amazon or something, but it's awesome because it's just so bad. So I definitely think if you are a fan of either Rifftrax or Mystery Science Theater 3000 or just that kind of comedy, you're really going to enjoy this podcast. And, there'll be ups and downs depending on the material they're reviewing. And you really don't have to read along. Like, that was one of the takeaways for me, was because at first I felt like you had to. And so that's one of the reasons I skipped a few, like I skipped Armada because I haven't read that one. And then I picked back up when they started reviewing, I think, The Mister, because I was like, well, that's going to be so basic. I'll be able to follow it even if I don't read it. And for those who don't know, The Mister is a follow-up to the follow-up book by the author of 50 Shades of Grey series. It's not related to 50 Shades of Grey, but it's really awful. I've not read that series, but I can tell you The Mister's bad.
No less.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, so I think if you enjoy any of those, and if you don't know Rifftrax, I highly recommend checking it out. If you do end up trying this podcast and you really like it, like, I think you're going to find Rifftrax and MST3K are going to be right up your alley. I did think it was kind of hilarious when they were reviewing Ready Player One that they mentioned that Mike was a little bit worried that there might be a reference to MST3K, which I'm honestly surprised there's not. Like, it is a very popular thing among nerds, so.
I would assume that Ernest Cline is a fan of MST3K, and I would assume that he knows that this podcast exists, and it makes me wonder what his take would be on it.
I know, it's like, would you be proud of the fact? I mean, they definitely did a Rifftrax on the movie Ready Player One. And I think I've watched that. I might be conflating it with this series in the podcast, but yeah, I think they've done a riff on. I'm confident they've done a riff on Ready Player One, the movie too. So yeah, it's probably a good chance he's aware of it. That would be funny to see if he was either offended or if he actually like enjoyed it. Kind of embraced it the way Tommy Wiseau did.
Right. And one of the things about, and you had mentioned it earlier, how, because, Ready Player One, the movie, was a Spielberg movie, and you were talking about Jaws, that there's a Rifftrax for that and whatnot. And I think for the movies that are like legitimately good that do a Rifftrax for, it feels like they're forced to find something to joke about.
Yep.
Which, and I think that, and I've noticed that a little bit in Ready Player One, is that they feel like they're forced to have to be, or they're forced to make fun of it in certain sections, and so I think they get a little nitpicky on certain things. But again, it's all in the, it's all for the sake of comedy. So that's one of the things to keep in mind, is that if you happen to really enjoy, which, don't get me wrong, Ready Player One is not a well-written book, but it was still enjoyable. Just simply because if you're a geek, you're gonna like it. But if any of those books that they do that you legitimately like, just realize that their whole point of view is we are supposed to make fun of this book, and we're going to find every instance that we can to do that. Yeah,
that's actually a good point. I hadn't really thought about it, but I think that's a key to why some of the books are much more enjoyable to listen to the podcast about, because while I enjoyed the Ready Player One series a lot, you're right, it's much, much more nitpicky than when you get into something that's just truly awfully bad. They did a run on, it was a book written by guy who wrote Dracula. I can't remember.
Bram Stoker?
Yes, Bram Stoker. And it's called The White Worm. And there's a reason you've never heard of it. It is horrifically bad. Like, I don't know how somebody who wrote a book that is so celebrated and beloved and considered a classic wrote something this garbage, but he did. So that one was really enjoyable because, it's so over the top bad. They don't have to nitpick because the story itself is just dumb. And so that's, I think, where they really shine is on those truly bad books.
Yeah. And I think also I actually wouldn't mind if they did a Lord of the Rings version of the podcast series. And the reason why I say that, because I am a super ultra Tolkien nerd, and I revere it as some of the greatest works of fantasy writing or just fiction in general. But I do know that those books are not written for a modern audience. Mm-hmm. They're not easy to read in a modern setting. So sure, when the books came out, it's a different story, but these books, the characters are fairly one-dimensional with the exception of a handful of them, and and where those books shine is in the world building and whatnot. But it'd be interesting to see their take, simply because of the fact that these books are kind of old and archaic in a way, and they're definitely not written for the modern audience.
Yeah, that would be interesting. They haven't really flirted with anything that kind of widely. Ready Player One's very popular, obviously, as well as Midnight Sun. But they haven't really flirted with anything kind of that widely recognized as a classic. Although, to your point, there's definitely flaws. There's things they could nitpick on and have fun with. So, I am technically a very low-level Patreon supporter of theirs, so maybe I'll suggest that.
Yeah. To be honest, like Harry Potter, I love the Harry Potter series, but I can nitpick it to death, because while the story's good and Rowling is very good at world build. Well, let me rephrase that. She's built a compelling story, but I have major issues with her world building, and but that doesn't mean I don't like the books or I don't love the books.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, because I actually was just recently rereading them, and because I hadn't in a long, long time, and I've listened to the really excellent audiobook version of those, which was the one by Jim Dale, and I hadn't read the books since I originally read them. So, and going back through, I was like, obviously the first few books are clearly written for children. And I think one of her geniuses is the way she changes that throughout the series as the readers grow up along with the books. But, they're not perfect. There's definitely flaws. There's definitely things you could point out. So yeah, I think there's room for them to dip into stuff that's, beloved or incredibly popular, or, and I think that's where initially they kind of started. I think that was their intent, because they of course started with the two Klein books. But I think it's obviously much easier to find some self-published crap on Amazon and go with that.
There is a plethora of self-published books on Amazon that are complete garbage.
Yes, exactly. And what I also love about this, because it's super charming, is they have a pretty decent sized following now. And so, suddenly some writer of some crap book on Amazon is going to get a bunch of revenue because a lot of the fans do read along. And so like the guy who wrote Trucking Through Time, like why all of a sudden did he, he's like one day there's 85 purchases of his book or whatever, he had to be like, what's going on? So I kind of I get a kick out of that, like thinking these authors who have probably sold maybe 5 of their books, suddenly get this huge spike in sales, not knowing why. But
there's one book that kind of became a low-level meme on the internet. Now I'd have to find the title of it, but it's a guy who says he's spent his whole life writing this book. And it's a very big book from what I understand. But it's written very terribly, and the art cover looks like it was done by like a 5-year-old. And people who legitimately buy the book and read it, review it on Amazon, and he fights tooth and nail about any tiny critique.
Oh, gosh.
And literally there's hundreds of pages on the Amazon reviews of him just arguing with all the reviewers. And so I'll have to get the name of the book. I don't remember. It's like Princess Consuela or something is the name of the book.
Oh, God.
I'll have to find it, and maybe that's something you can suggest to him, because it's apparently hot garbage, and the author is very meme-worthy in of himself.
Oh, I love it. These are the reasons I love the internet. The fact that, now it's just a thing to go and leave a terrible review for this guy. That's a great idea. They do actually, it's one thing I didn't call out in the profile of it, but they do occasionally do kind of dips into reviews. One of my favorite things that they did, they've only done it a couple of times, I think, but they'll find the 5-star reviews for books, for these books, these really bad books. And they'll go and check that person's other reviews of other products on Amazon. And then they'll do like a quiz. Like, okay, here's, this lady rated, the Mr. 5 stars. What did she think of a 5-pack of ice cube trays? And then the other host will have to guess, what they rated that item. And that's usually highly entertaining. So I think they could probably have a lot of fun with that book.
By the way, the name of the book is Empress Teresa.
Empress Teresa. Okay.
Yes. So I would highly recommend you suggest that to them, because
okay,
it's something else.
Okay. I'm going to have to do that then. You ready to give this one a verdict?
Yeah. I personally, I don't hate it. I think it's a great podcast, and if you're a fan of that, MST3K and Rifftrax, you'll be right at home with this.
Yeah, and I've obviously shown my hand here by confessing that I'm a low-level Patreon supporter for them, but I obviously definitely don't hate it either. It's entertaining, and what's great is because it is kind of a series, where you could stand alone listen to just the episodes about Ready Player One, or you could, I recommend if you're going to jump into this podcast, start with the first episode of a book, whether it's that one or Shadow Moon, which that wouldn't be the one I'd recommend first, or Midnight Sun or whatever, especially if, I will say, the series on Midnight Sun has been highly entertaining. If you are a fan of Rifftrax, you know that probably one of their best series of Rifftrax has been the Twilight series. It is the only way to make those movies watchable, and it's some of their best work. So having riffed those movies, they're also very familiar with the Twilight, at least the story. I don't think they've read the books, but so watching them realize with growing horror that this 700-page book is only a retelling of the first movie. Like, they got like a third of the way into it, and they're like, I think this just covers the first movie. How can that be? Because it's so long. Is super entertaining, and obviously you don't really have to read the book on that one either to know the story, because it's a real basic story. So definitely recommend. I don't hate it, and I will continue listening for sure. So for our second podcast, we're going to be talking about Timcast IRL.
It's a kind of a webcast / podcast series from the independent journalist Tim Pool. He's got numerous YouTube channels, and he uploads like a crazy person, multiple videos a day. I don't think he actually sleeps, but and he mostly centers around news and politics. So what we're going to be covering specifically is his live stream of him discussing his thoughts on the news of the day, and he has co-hosts on there too. Sometimes he has rotating co-hosts, and he discusses usually daily political news. And the guests that he has usually come from different backgrounds. A lot of them may be, people who used to be Democrats or not Democrats anymore, or Republicans, or people who still are Democrats. And so I feel like it's a wide range of guests that he will have. And if you do listen just on YouTube, he does have a whole super chat section, which some people may find interesting or not. But I believe on the podcast version that you get from your regular podcast feed does not include that, which I think that's how you consume it. Is that correct?
Yeah. I listen to it through my through the app I use for listening to podcasts on my phone. So I have, just for the purposes of consuming this as I think it's probably intended, I did check it out a little bit on YouTube, but most of the episodes I've listened to have been as a podcast feed. Right.
And Tim, he's what he does is that he will have his live broadcast, and then he has like his videos that he'll create, which I don't know if those are published out to podcast platforms or not, but they're usually 10 to 15 or 20 minute videos of various news articles and topics that he wants to discuss. And he will also break up his podcast into segments, so which is handy, because if you don't want to listen to the full thing, you can at least go on YouTube and see, they talked about this specific topic for 20 minutes. I just want to listen to that piece. So there is an option to kind of take it in piecemeal as opposed to listening to the whole podcast. And Tim is a very interesting guy. He's very young. I think he's not even 30 yet. I think he's in his late 20s. And he's come from a very troubled background. He's a mixed race. I think his mother is Korean. And, he's been homeless. He never graduated high school. And after the Occupy Wall Street movement, that's when he got kind of some fame, and he started working for various outlets. I think he worked for Vox at one point, but eventually he decided to break off and be his own independent journalist, which was where his YouTube career kind of kicked off. So any thoughts on your... now me, I'm very familiar with Tim's work. I definitely don't think has like a perfect track record, but from your little bit of exposure to him, I'm sure you've watched a couple episodes. What's your take on him so far?
Well, so I actually had heard of him before I started listening. So just for context, I don't listen to a lot of political news / current event types of podcasts or shows. So this is branching out of my normal comfort zone for podcasts, because I typically listen to them for more entertainment value or education. But I have heard of him because I heard him on, I think he's been on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple of times. And I vaguely remember, I don't know how I knew this, but I vaguely remembered that he did something where he went to, I'm probably going to butcher this. I don't know if he went to Sweden. He went to some...
Yeah, it was Sweden. That was another big exposure point for him. He went to cover the no-go zones in Sweden.
Yes. I do remember seeing some clips of him talking about that somewhere. I don't know where. Probably on YouTube. But, so I was aware of him as an independent journalist. And... he, one thing you can say about him is he makes it very clear where he stands politically when you listen to the show, virtually on every episode at some point, which is probably good. I mean, if you're coming in cold, I think it's important to know where someone's, if you're listening to a show about politics and news, to know where your host's politics lie, because that's, today, in today's world, everybody's got a bias, and it helps for context to know what that bias is. And he's kind of a center-left, person who's clearly a bit disenfranchised from the Democratic Party and where it's gone, I guess the Democratic Party is where his frustration would be. But yeah, so I I appreciate that he's very clear about that. He's also, you can very much tell that he's been burned many times by having something he says taken out of context and or fact-checked, because it feels like every other thing he claims or says on the podcast or the live stream, he says, well, fact-check me on this, or, don't quote me on this, or like he says that a lot to the point where it's noticeable.
It could be for very minor things, too.
Yes, yes.
Like, fact check me. I think he was wearing a red coat, but don't quote me on that. Fact check me.
Exactly. So, and he has a delivery style that reminds me a lot of, like, Ben Shapiro. He's young, fast-talking, that kind of, I don't know. Maybe that's like a breed of young journalists slash political commentators nowadays, where they just talk really fast and, they're very coherent, but it kind of sounds like sometimes it could get a little, I don't want to say overwhelming, but if you're listening to it while you're doing something else and you get distracted, it starts to just sound like this noise in your ear. So I found that this is not a podcast I want to listen to while I'm doing something else, because it'll get annoying really fast.
Yeah, he's definitely a fast talker, and that's kind of a meme around the internets, that he's a super fast talker. And there's actually some very funny parody videos and cartoons that he's actually done guest voiceover work for, that makes fun of the fact of his very fast speech pattern. So he's able to poke fun of himself, which is good. I mean, he realizes he is kind of a meme, and his iconic beanie is people don't notice he's actually completely bald. Like, he's lost all of his hair. And
really?
That's why I think that's why he wears the beanie all the time. And I'll never forget one time he was at the White House. There was a bunch of independent journalists who are popular on social media that were invited to the White House. He was there, and you could just see in the crowd one guy wearing a beanie, so you knew that was Tim Pool. But he said the benefit of that is that he's not, when he takes off, he doesn't get recognized in public, which he says that's actually a really nice thing. So I guess there's that, because it's kind of become his persona now, is wearing the beanie.
I did pick up on that pretty quickly, that was like a thing. And I don't remember why. There was a couple of comments that were made or something where, I realized that that's sort of like a signature look for him. I did not know he was bald. So for a young guy, that's kind of funny. But I just assumed it was a holdover from his skater boy, Occupy days, just hanging on to the 90s a little bit, but not even 90s, early 2000s. But yeah, so he's an interesting character. I think he makes for a good podcast host in that respect. I do think I was fairly impressed with, he seems to have a lot of guests on, at least, again, I'm just basing this on, I've listened to maybe the last 2 weeks or so worth of his episodes, so maybe like 10 episodes total. And generally it seems like he has hosts or guests on that are very, not exactly politically aligned with him, but similar. But I did notice when he had a guest on that was, had a lot of differing views from him, that they had it didn't turn into what I hate about all other political shows, where they start just, trying to talk over each other and, get heated or anything. They were able to have, to debate points intelligently without turning it into a, listen to me shouting match. So I did appreciate that, because that's one of the things I can't stand about, well, most news today anyway, but a lot of these, so-called political podcasts where it's just a lot of people yelling at each other. So I thought that was really good. He's clearly, right now it feels like, and I don't know if this is true, because I know he talks a lot about where he is politically, which again, I said is kind of center left. But he is so frustrated with the Democratic Party and how they've shifted from their values. Like, he's a big anti-war guy, and obviously he was a big Occupy guy. So he has a lot of kind of liberal views on those things, but he's really kind of irritated with the Democratic Party not like caring about some of those things anymore, presumably. So right now it feels kind of like a slightly right-wing type of podcast, or maybe very right-wing type of podcast, because they're very tied up in talking about the election and, the fact that he's voting for Trump and the things that he likes that Trump's done. So I think somebody going into this who's supremely left wing or somebody who's not, or who, hates Trump is probably not going to enjoy this podcast very much. But for me, I thought it was, it's pretty good. I some of his mannerisms, like I said, get a little on my nerves. He's very kind of dude and bro. And again, I'm significantly older than him, so it might just be me, like, just being annoyed by a guy who talks like he's in his early 20s. But and he also comes across a little bit, what's the word? Not pretentious, but, because like I said, when he has guests on, he's not like, I'm right, you're wrong all the time. But when he's voicing his opinion, it comes across that way a lot, like he's very kind of smug. At least that's what I got out of it, my impression of it. But I will say, he does spend a lot of time engaging with fans. They have the whole super chat section at the end of the show where, for those that don't know on YouTube, if you're watching a live stream, you can pay to have your chat, your comment elevated to a super chat, which then the host can see. And so he'll spend a good portion of the show each time, each day going through and reading the super chats and commenting on them and stuff. And, sometimes it's people disagreeing with him or disagreeing with the guest, and he, doesn't get upset about that. He reads it off and says, oh, that's, your perspective. That's kind of cool. So, overall, he feels pretty balanced, but, again, this isn't really my kind of podcast, so I had to really come at it with an open mind and try not to get irritated.
Well, one thing you touched on is that, his guests are, for the most part, they are right-leaning, and I think that's because he can't get anybody from the left to actually join his podcast, because he's not a fan of, the Biden ticket. He's not a fan of Kamala Harris. He's a diehard Tulsi and Bernie guy, right? Mm-hmm. But yet, for some reason, he still gets labeled as some kind of heretical conservative. And so that's the problem, is like his pool of guests to pull from is very, very small. But one thing that's interesting that I really appreciate about Tim Pool is that he has, unlike a lot of political commentators on YouTube, they don't get very much, what's the word I'm looking for? There's not a lot of favorability from YouTube on that type of content. And I would say that YouTube is fairly antagonistic against it in general, but he seems to have connections and insight to people at YouTube and at Twitter, and not so much Facebook. It's really just kind of Twitter and YouTube, where he's able to get away with things, I think, a lot more than some other people who may do political stuff on YouTube, who speak politically on Twitter do. For some reason, he's able to build those kind of connections, which, one of his probably most famous episode on Joe Rogan was with CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey.
Yep.
To confront Dorsey on a lot of the hypocrisy that Twitter has. And it's a fantastic podcast because Tim is very well educated on, how social media, YouTube, and all this stuff works, and how the rules and regulations are very unevenly applied to people. And so he's very much in the know with that. And I part of me thinks he actually has regular discussions with upper, I don't know if it's executive level, but there's definitely some higher level employees, I think, at YouTube that he has contacts with, because there's some things he says here and there that kind of leads me to believe that. And so that gives him a lot more insight, I think, into the whole social media ecosphere, especially when it comes to politics and current affairs, that a lot of other people do not have. And he does play that up a lot because, and again, it's something that becomes kind of tiring because there's certain words you can't say on YouTube or you get demonetized, or there's certain things you can't cover or you get demonetized. And so you can tell he's very frustrated by that, and he tries to work around it. And sometimes that can get kind of annoying, but that's just him kind of trying to play the game, though. But I think that's where ultimately I look for Tim Pool, is his coverage on kind of the inner workings of how social media is working, because I feel like he has kind of a pulse on that.
Yeah, that was actually, I think, what, when you listed this podcast as a candidate for us to talk about, one of the reasons I gravitated towards it first was because I had seen him on Joe Rogan, that specific episode you're talking about with Jack Dorsey. And I thought, he came across incredibly well prepared, incredibly intelligent, very, like you said, educated on the topic, which I think it made the episode very, very interesting. And obviously, it made Jack Dorsey not look so great, because I don't think he and the other guests that they had on from Twitter were very prepared for that, clearly. So I think, he did such a good job there. I was interested to see what this podcast would be like. Now, I will say that some of the things that I don't care for with the podcast, I think, I should call it a web stream or a live stream, which is really what it is. But some of the things I don't care for, I think, are more tied to the nature of this specific show for him, because I think, my guess is, and I haven't watched any of it, but my guess is on his sort of news videos, he's probably a lot more confident in what he's presenting. And, he probably doesn't do all the whole fact check me, because a lot of this is just talking off the cuff and having conversations. So, he'll say, oh, I believe so-and-so said this. And he says, but fact check me or don't quote me on this. Because I think, again, obviously he's been burned by that in the past. And, he's clearly somebody who really does his homework when he is speaking on a topic that he knows a lot about. So it's clear that this specific, stream of his is much more conversational in nature and not meant to be a source of news. It's just meant to be, here's where we talk about the news and our thoughts on it. So, I think that makes, that's important context to have if you're listening to this show as a podcast, or if you're watching it on YouTube, understanding that it's not supposed to be a source of information so much as just a chance to listen to people kind of break down their thoughts on the news of the day, the political news of the day.
Yeah, and I will say that his news episodes that are outside of the actual webcast is much more presented as news, and where he does fact check, and he'll bring up areas that he has fact checked, and how he can say, oh well, this is what they wrote here is wrong, and here's why, and he pulls up another article that kind of counters whatever article he's covering. And I think what helps with that too, what makes him a kind of successful independent journalist, is the fact that he's worked for these organizations that write a lot of these articles. He's worked for Fusion, Vox, and maybe one other, which a lot of these sites kind of start off as blogging sites that kind of masquerade as journalist sites, and so he knows how they work and what drives them to write what they write. And he provides a lot of context when you see a Vox article that has like some insane headline. He provides context of like why this was written or how this was written, because he's worked for these companies before. He knows how they operate from the inside. So, and that's kind of a thing that you appreciate, because you're not going to hear somebody at Fox News or CNN to kind of say, well, here's how the sausage is made. This is why we're telling you the story the way that we're telling it to you. So he's able to provide that kind of context to that, and and sometimes and because we know a lot of the media is definitely they favor the left, and he's a person who feels like he's a man without a party, essentially. Like, that he feels like the Democratic Party's kind of left him behind, but he doesn't really feel like the conservative parties really represent him, so he's just kind of like stuck in the middle with no party. He definitely kind of gets a little annoying, just because most of his articles is kind of talking about, well, how woke the left has gotten. And he is usually able to criticize both sides of the aisle, but he definitely does focus on a lot of hypocrisy on the left more than the right. And I don't know if that's an argument to say, well, is the right more hypocritical than the left? I don't know. It's almost impossible to tell these days with how the media is, but he does, a lot of his content is like, oh, look how woke the left has gotten. This is crazy. And that constitutes a lot of the stuff that he will talk about. And, when he actually covers his actual, legitimate news, it is good coverage. But I think sometimes just to fill in content, he has to say, but haha, look how woke the left got here. Isn't that crazy? And so that can be a little tiresome. And and I think he is a master of the YouTube algorithm, I will say, because you can look at his views. He gets insane amount of views. He has a very high monetization rate for a political channel. And again, that's why it tells me that he has some kind of connection with the insides of YouTube specifically. But while he like has a really successful YouTube platform, I think he's also kind of starting to get into hyperbole quite a bit, because he can be very hyperbolic. Like he's been saying this for a long time. It's like, oh, we're on the brink of a civil war. There's a civil war going to break out. And I mean, he's buying like guns and ammos. He's like moving out of the city centers because he's like, it's not going to be safe when civil war breaks out. And it's almost like he's like the non-conspiratorial version of Alex Jones, where it's just like he gets super hyperbolic. I mean, at times it's more entertaining than it is anything else.
Yeah, I will say that, like, again, being someone that doesn't listen to a lot of, honestly, I don't even watch that much news coverage. Like, I will spend 4 minutes scanning like headlines at the beginning of the day, and then that's it. I don't, just because I've gotten really tired of it, and it's all hyperbole these days. But I will say, if you listen to it, if you're coming in cold and you're like, oh, this is this well-respected independent journalist, and then you're like, oh my God, he thinks there's going to be a civil war. Like, you could get a little panicky if you were listening to this. Like, and I do agree with you on the point about, talking about the woke left. I mean, I understand that it's a hot topic right now. Like, a lot of, even though I don't dip into political, I do listen to interview shows like Joe Rogan, or I listen to some, podcasts that come from news organizations or, media like Freakonomics, things like that. So, I hear of that talk a lot. But you're right. There's probably an excessive amount of it, just because, again, I understand the reactions and I understand the need to discuss it, but it feels like it is something that, like, if we don't have a lot to talk about today, let's talk about the left being super woke and how silly it is. And it does kind of get old, and maybe I'm burned out a little bit because I do listen to Joe Rogan as well, and it's also a popular topic there too. But it does start to feel a little repetitive sometimes, but
well, and I think people could definitely see, like, and I'm sure Joe Rogan's one of the top listened podcasts too in the world, so I'm sure anybody who's listened to this will have listened to a Joe Rogan podcast. Nobody in their right mind would say, oh, Joe Rogan's a conservative.
Right.
Anybody who's listened to any level of Joe Rogan will know that. But yet he's labeled as that by the media because they just don't like what he talks about. And Tim is the target of that. And I think that's made him a little paranoid, because I do feel his hyperbole sometimes comes from paranoia. And he's actually had people who have stalked him before, like come in his house at 3 a.m.
Wow.
He's literally had the New Jersey police tell him, yeah, there's nothing you can do. You just need to buy a shotgun. The cops were like, there's not much we could do, because the cops arrested the guy, they released him, and he showed back up like 2 hours later, so at 5 a.m. at Tim's house.
Oh my gosh.
And so that's made Tim incredibly paranoid, and I think in general he's just a paranoid person because he's been attacked so many times. He's been taken out of context so many times. Like, he can actually be quoting somebody saying something terrible, and they will attribute that quote to Tim. Just because it's a convenient attack.
Right.
And that happens all over the place, but Tim is especially, because I think he has very deep convictions in what he believes in, and that's why he's like, I'm not going where the left is going, and I'm not a conservative because I believe XYZ. He has very deep convictions about it, and if they're ever misrepresented, he gets very defensive about that. And I think that comes in with the repetitiveness of, don't fact check me, don't quote me on that over and over again, because he's been the target of that so often. He's just gotten a little paranoid, and I think with just the crazy times we're in, that his paranoia may have increased some with his, like, I'm moving out of the city, I'm buying guns, and he's just, and I think maybe his hyperbole is based off his paranoia. It's interesting. The Tim Pool now versus Tim Pool of 2016 is a very different person. While his political stances haven't changed, I will say that how he approaches things definitely has changed.
It's interesting context because I thought it was interesting. You know, it was something I noted as I was listening to the episodes I listened to, is that he very, very frequently reiterates that, you know, he was an Occupy guy, that he, you know, voted for Obama in at least the first time around. That, you know, he was all in for Obama. He's incredibly anti-war. Like he brings this up a lot. And I think my guess was, as I was listening to this, without having that context, was that he's probably been attacked as being, you know, alt-right or whatever, just because,
yes,
you know, he's decided that he's going to vote for Trump. And so, or he's had guests on that are considered, or either are conservative or are considered alt-right or whatever. So I think, you know, because anybody these days who challenges, you know, kind of the overall media narrative kind of gets that label slapped on them, I think. So I just assumed that was probably the case. And I think he doesn't like being labeled that way because, you know, he clearly tries to make the point that, look, this is where I stand and this is why I'm voting the way I'm voting. But, you know, I'm not conservative. I'm very liberal on all these things. So I think obviously, you know, he talks about the fact that he's much more pro-gun ownership than he used to be. And that's interesting. I did not know about him having somebody come into his house. That would probably change your opinion on the Second Amendment, I guess, even if you were like anti-gun before. And so, especially with everything that's been going on, I know I've heard plenty of stories from people, you know, said, well, I never had a gun before, but I decided I should probably have one for, you know, home defense or whatever. So I figured it was more along those lines, but that makes a whole lot more sense as to why he's moved out to the middle of nowhere and has bought all these guns. You know, that would be a scary experience. So yeah, I think it is good to have some of that context, because just coming in cold and diving in like 2 weeks ago and just listening to the current episodes, I definitely was like, all right, he's got a bone to pick here. He keeps reiterating these things. Like, there's got to be reasons for it. And I think that probably makes a lot of sense. But it just does feel like a little bit of overkill when you're listening to it, you know, again, without that additional context.
Right. And I think the fact that, you know, he wants everybody to know, like, where he is politically, like, and that it's very important to him. And, you know, and I don't think he realizes that, you know, labels like fascist and alt-right and stuff are kind of thrown lazily about these days, to where, I mean, you have people calling Ben Shapiro alt-right, which is, you know, white supremacist movement or white nationalist movement, and Ben Shapiro is probably the Jewest Jew that ever Jewed, and yet they still say he's alt-right. And so I think most people don't really take those. I think there are people who just take that label as, you know, like, oh, well, somebody in the news told me that, you know, Tim Pool's alt-right or Ben Shapiro's alt-right, so they must be alt-right. But I think most people just are tired of hearing those terms being thrown around, that they probably don't take it seriously anymore. But for Tim, it's a very deep offense to him, because, you know, I think he does have very deep convictions. And I think that's the reason why he was a fan of kind of the older Bernie, like the 2016 Democratic primary Bernie. He wasn't very happy with Bernie in the last election because he felt he got a little bit more corporate on the Democrat side. And that's the reason why he was such a big Tulsi fan, because I think Tulsi does have like legitimate deep convictions about her beliefs, and not really political stances that are based around like a focus group like a lot of politicians these days have. So he's a huge Tulsi fan, so he brings her up quite often. So if you're going to listen to it, expect to hear about Tulsi Gabbard at some point.
Yeah, well, considering how much he, like, it clearly, one of the impressions I got from him was, to your point, he's very strongly, like, he has real strong opinions and strong convictions, and especially when it comes to anti-war, anti-foreign wars, because he's mentioned it a lot, and B, you know, he talks about multiple times about how betrayed he felt by the Obama administration, like with all the drone attacks and continuing the wars and not drawing back the troops like they said he would, and he was just really betrayed by that, because that's clearly his number one issue. And so I'm not surprised at all that he would be a big Tulsi fan because, I think from what I understand of her, that was one of her big points was, getting us out of all these conflicts in other countries. So I could see that being something that like would appeal to him. But yeah, I do think it's kind of funny. There was a guest he had on, I don't remember. Is it Seamus? Sean? I don't remember. Anyway, he has like a cartoon channel on YouTube. I think it's called Freedom Tunes or something like that.
yes. Tim has appeared on Freedom Tunes before.
Yeah, well, I actually, because of course, anytime there's a guest, I'll like go check out whatever they have for like 5 minutes, and it was actually pretty entertaining. I think I just clicked on some of his most popular videos, and one of them was, I think, like Ben Shapiro Family Thanksgiving, and it was hysterical. So he's had some really entertaining guests on, and he also had, in one of the episodes I listened to, oh gosh, I can't remember her name. Again, I'm so out of touch with this stuff, but she's running, I think, in Baltimore. Kim Kasich.
Yes, yeah,
Kim
I know who you're talking about,
yeah.
yes.
Yep, and she had that viral political video campaign ad, which I actually did see at some point. That's how viral it went, because I don't hang out around that sort of stuff, but I've seen it. It's really interesting, but I do think it is very clear that he's got a chip on his shoulder about being labeled alt-right. But then, like you said, with the whole Joe Rogan thing, it's like I've seen, I follow, again, I don't get too involved on the social side of most of the podcasts. There's one podcast where I am a member of like a Facebook group for that podcast, and it's full of super, very liberal people. It's not a liberal podcast. It's more of a comedy podcast, but it's just, the fans of it are all super liberal. It's Pacific Northwest area. So, and multiple times I've seen memes about, alt-right podcasters. It's always clearly Joe Rogan that they're referencing. And it's just kind of funny to me, because I'm like, people must not listen to him who label him alt-right. Because just like with Tim, I don't think Joe does it as much as Tim does, but he's made it clear on multiple occasions, like, hey, I am liberal, these are the things I believe in, and I think it kind of speaks to the general level of discourse when these podcast hosts and or news hosts, whatever, people in the media have to constantly reiterate what their politics are, because regardless of what you say, if you have a perspective on something that doesn't align with the official line or whatever, then you're going to immediately be labeled the opposite side. So I get why he does it, for sure. It just, if you're listening daily, which his podcast is out every day, Monday through Friday, this particular show is. So if you're listening to it daily, which I did just to kind of, dip my toes in and be prepared to talk about it, I was just like, holy moly. Like, I get it. You said this every day for the last 2 weeks.
Well, and one thing to some context as well. I mean, his rotating guest spot, that's actually a fairly new thing. Probably within the last 2.5 months. Because it used to be, he has, his co-host, I can't remember her name. I always forget it.
Lydia.
Lydia, yeah.
Something.
So he always has Lydia with him, and he used to have another co-host named Adam Krigler. And that was it. They very rarely would they have a guest. It was just those three doing the podcast. Mm-hmm. And Adam was much more kind of a jokey kind of, Tim's generally pretty serious guy for the most part.
Yeah.
And so Adam was kind of the polar opposite of him, and it did create a really fine balance, or it was a nice balance to have, because Adam he was full on Trump. You look the guy, he looks like a stoner skateboarder guy, but he was like full on, wearing the Trump beanie and stuff, and which Tim refuses to wear, despite many other political pundits have sent him MAGA beanies as a joke. He has not worn them yet. But apparently him and Adam had created differences, and Adam left the company, and he started his own thing. I haven't really listened to his stuff because I think because it's just him, and I don't think he himself will be strong enough to hold his own podcast. But so they started rotating in out guests to kind of fill in Adam's spot, and I think that's actually been helpful for the podcast. I think the podcast has actually improved. Not to say anything bad about Adam, but I do think having these rotating guests have been it's been a boon for the podcast personally.
Yeah, I think the other, I can't decide if he's a co-host. I think he is at this point, is Ian Crossland. He's had him on like every episode I've listened to.
Yeah, I think he might be Adam's replacement, but I think now that, I think that having the rotating guests has been successful enough that they've just decided to keep guesting, because at one point it was just to fill in Adam's spot.
Gotcha.
So it wasn't just him and Lydia, but I think they just decided just to keep guests in.
Yeah, and I think technically in the last episode I was listening to, she's mentioned as a producer. So I think she's a co-host, but I think she's also a producer. And then Ian, I think he's just there for commentary as well. I think I found it interesting because I think Ian seems to be much more traditionally liberal than. He's pretty closely aligned, I think, with where Tim's at on most things, but he definitely they've gotten into it a few times, not like arguing officially where it gets annoying and I would have tuned out immediately because I hate that. But
friendly debate.
Yeah, they were having a debate about something and I don't even remember what it was, but it was very much, Ian was taking a very, very liberal stance on it, and I think Tim was challenging on it. But I feel like I haven't gotten the impression that he brings a lot to this show. I think Lydia doesn't. I mean, she chimes in quite frequently, and will bring up her opinion. But I think she's also being there as a producer. She's also doing a lot of stuff technically while they're on. And again, I also dipped into this right at a time when they had just moved out to wherever he is in the middle of the country, and so I think they've had some technical difficulties, and I think it's obviously upset the balance of the show just a little bit while they've been dealing with that. So there's that as well.
Which is funny because they spent so much money on the new studio, or the studio that they were in previously, because it was a very nice studio, and they spent a lot of money on that. And then the unrest happened, especially was highly affected his area, and he's like, "Well, I'm just going to get up and move."
Where were they?
So I can only imagine the cost of that.
Where were they based before?
They were in New Jersey. I don't know specifically because Tim was just like, nobody can know where I live because, stalkers and whatnot. So my political enemies are going to get me. So he was very quiet about that. I just knew it was in New Jersey area.
Gotcha. Yeah, he obviously has not said where he's at, other than he's out in the middle of nowhere, basically. And they've had some internet problems as a result of that. In fact, I was just listening to, before we started today, I was listening to the most recent episode, and I think they lost internet and lost the stream in the middle of it. They're like, do we keep going? But what's funny about the podcast, and I think that's probably worth pointing out here, that the podcast, it's a live stream first, and it's a podcast second. So it is available if, it's an RSS feed. If you have a podcatcher app that you're using, you can get it. It's Timcast IRL, but it's clearly a live stream first. And so...
and remember, Joe Rogan originally was that way until only maybe 6 to 9 months ago.
Yes. And I think, it makes sense to put it on YouTube as well, even if most podcasts are on YouTube, even if there's no a video component at all. But I think if you're somebody who likes to engage with the hosts of the things that you listen to, you'd probably get more out of the live stream and then the super chat and interacting with other people who are listening and interact. I haven't done that, so I don't know if the chat's completely worthless like most YouTube chats, or if it's actually, enjoyable to engage in, but you can at least have some interaction with the host. You don't get that if you're just listening to it as a podcast, which is what I do. So, there is that component. I know, we've discussed a few times what technically qualifies as a podcast, because you tend to have a broader definition than I do. But, to me, if it's not on my podcatcher app or not available as an RSS feed, I don't know if I qualify it as a podcast. But I'm willing to expand my definition.
Well, I know we talked about it. If there's no video element required, then it could be a podcast. But again, it kind of looks like Joe Rogan's one of the top podcasts in the world, and it always started off as a video, or on video platforms. I think it originally started off on Justin TV, maybe.
Really?
Which was the precursor to Twitch. So it's always been a video podcast first, and so there's plenty of podcasts on YouTube that are just podcasts. They call it podcasts. It has the format of a podcast, and they just may have just a static image on the video, but
Yeah.
they just use YouTube because I think mainly because I don't know how monetization works for podcasts. I don't know if there's a click-through rate, advertising, stuff like that. And now I know there's endorsements where they can actually do, hey, this podcast is sponsored by Tommy John Underwear or whatever. So I know that there's money to be made there, but on YouTube you can get monetization that for ads that run during your podcast, and you can also get the super chats, which are YouTube does collect a portion of that money, but if for a lot of these people that can be significant. There's a YouTuber, which I will not name at this time, who does live streams, and he probably gets at least $400-$500 per episode just on super chats. So, and he does them like every other day. And again, no real video element required. So I think unless you're able to get like corporate sponsorships, YouTube is, I think, a way for people to monetize and make money so they can actually continue to do what they do. And I think that's the reason why I kind of broaden that, because there is a lot of content on YouTube. And again, there is a lot of content that's just purely podcast related, but I think you have to kind of look at the gamut, because it's really going to be the people who are trying to earn money doing it, or at least try to support themselves. I think they're going to look at YouTube first, because that's how Tim operates. They're looking at YouTube first, and then their podcast RSS feeds second.
Yeah, and that's one thing I would call out too with this podcast, and I don't think we mentioned it with the first one, but the true is it's the same there, is that there are no. I mean, okay, if you're listening to it on YouTube and you don't have YouTube Red or something, I'm assuming there's ads, but from a podcast perspective, there are no ads. There's no sponsorship reads. There's no, inserted ads or any of that, which is nice because, if you listen to podcasts regularly, ads is just a part of, it's how people monetize their podcasts. So it happens. And I typically don't mind. I especially prefer when podcast hosts will make an effort to do their sponsorship reads in some sort of creative way that engages, where they actually kind of continue their discussion, but, include the ad read. And sometimes it can actually be entertaining. But, one of the reasons I stay away from most podcasts that are part of a network, that have some exceptions, but especially the iHeart network, which is just awful. Because they'll just insert ads, and they're all garbage ads. They're they're not targeted in any way. They have nothing to do with the content you're listening to, and half of them are ads for other garbage podcasts on that network. So it's it becomes incredibly frustrating, especially if you've got a podcast you've been listening to, and suddenly they're now part of that network, and it's oh great, if I'm going to listen to this, I now have to put up with all these terrible ads. So I will say a big check mark in its favor is that, just like with the 372 Pages podcast, they're finding ways to monetize that don't require the ads, whether it's the super chats or the Patreon, kind of direct support model. It does eliminate the need to listen to ads, which again, I don't begrudge any podcast for having ads, right? That's a way to monetize. And that's why I think most podcasts, to your point, even if it is just an audio podcast, they will put it on YouTube, because why wouldn't you, right? It's additional monetization opportunity. But
well, and to kind of bring that back to Tim, he in his early days he would do I think VPN sponsorships, but otherwise I don't think he does any sponsorships. I think super chats and YouTube ad revenue is pretty much 100% all of his revenue.
Yeah, I can't recall, at least in the last, in the 2 weeks that I've been listening, I don't think I've heard any ads at all. So that kind of stood out to me at one point when I was taking notes and thinking about, this review. I was like, have I heard an ad? And I was like, I don't think I have. So, so that's kind of cool. It's something that can be annoying about consuming podcasts. So, again, don't have any problem with ads, because I realize that's how people can make a living doing podcasts. But I think that the way the ads are handled, or the way you monetize your podcast, can be incredibly annoying, or it can be engaging and part of the show. And if you choose to go solely fan supported, which is what it appears to be doing here, it makes for a better listening experience.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things is that the political space as a whole is very hard to monetize. especially when it comes to automated ad revenue, like YouTube, with Tim kind of being an exception, I believe. Because, I mean, his podcast is fairly clean. He doesn't curse at all. But a lot of times these sponsorships are the only way that these people can actually get money, because they get kicked off Patreon. They'll get banned from pretty much a lot of sites, so they have to use really just the direct sponsors. So some of them will even take some really crappy sponsors like Raid's Shadow Legends or something, a mobile game sponsor, but they pay good money, and it's like, hey, you know what? I can't make money any other way this way because I simply am expressing political views. So, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Tim is an exception to that, but he's definitely not the rule. And I think YouTube provides much greater opportunities for monetization in general, though. So I think that's why a lot of people are just doing only YouTube, because that's where the money's at, I think, for like more passive income.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, it's true of a lot of, you can always tell if a YouTube channel is considered controversial by YouTube standards, because they'll have their own ads, their own sponsors, and it's predictably always like, maybe some VPNs, maybe some, to your point, crappy mobile games, and you're like, okay, I think I know where this thing stands.
Dollar Shave Club,
yes,
Tommy John.
yeah, it's kind of predictable. So, but yeah, I overall, I mean, I think
we would accept those sponsorships.
Oh, of course. We are not, as I said, I'm not averse to ads. But yeah, so I think, it overall as a podcast, I think it's again, these are not the types of podcasts I prefer to listen to, but I do appreciate the fact that there's no yelling. There is some hyperbole, as you mentioned. But in general, it's not offensive. It's not, it didn't frustrate me or just leave me feeling depressed like a lot of political podcasts do. And again, I haven't listened to a ton of them, but I've tried to dip my toe in the water a few times and was just like, why am I spending my time listening to this? So this one was not bad. I think, from the perspective of how I would rate this one, I don't hate it. Probably not going to listen to it all that frequently, if I'm honest. But, just because it's not in my wheelhouse. But yeah, I don't hate it.
Yeah, and I don't hate it either. And I think it's better in small doses. I very rarely listen to like the full live stream, or go back and watch it after it's been posted, or listen to it. But I do take in like the broken out segments where they will break out the whole live stream into like 4 or 5 videos of just the specific topics they're covering. So that way I can get just the one piece I want to hear as opposed to listening to the whole thing. So I don't hate it, but it's best in smaller doses.
Yeah, and to that point, it's probably better consumed on YouTube or through the YouTube app versus like a podcast app where you don't have that ability to. And some podcasts will be really meticulous about breaking out their show that way, like into chapters, and then you can, the show notes will have where to go, what chapters cover what. This one does not do that as a podcast feed. It's just the whole show. So I think this is one where, if you're going to consume it, YouTube's probably the more logical way to consume it. But it is available in the podcast app if you really enjoy it and you want to listen to it. So
I think that wraps up episode 1.
Yep, absolutely. We have not picked out the podcast for episode 2. We'll be doing that shortly. But yeah, thanks for listening. Have thoughts you want to share? Send us an email at whyihateyourpodcast@gmail.com or visit our website at whyihateyourpodcast.com. You can also find us at Hate Your Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. Our intro, transition, and outro music is by Kevin MacLeod and licensed under Creative Commons. Please see the show notes for details.